The first dance of Lady Fenwick's autumn ball had already ended when he appeared in the doorway. Eleanor Prescott saw the cane before she saw the man. It was black, polished, and it struck the marble floor of the entrance hall with a sound that cut through the strings and the laughter and the rustle of silk. The crowd nearest the doors turned. Then the crowd behind them. Then the whole bright spinning room seemed to slow and settle, the way a river stills when something large moves beneath its surface. He was taller than she remembered. Leaner. The uniform was gone, replaced by a dark coat that sat close across his shoulders, and his hair, once kept military short, now touched his collar. He walked with the careful, deliberate gait of a man who had learned to manage pain in public, his left leg bearing weight a half-beat longer than his right, and the cane absorbing what the leg could not. Captain Julian Ashworth. Except he was not Captain Ashworth any longer. His brother had died of fever 6 months prior, and the second son had become Viscount Ashworth without ceremony, without celebration, and without setting foot on English soil until this evening. If you have ever watched someone enter a room and felt the whole shape of your evening change, you know the silence Eleanor held inside her chest in that moment. Stay close. This story earns its weight. Lady Fenwick's hand found Eleanor's elbow. The grip was not gentle. Stand back, girl. You are blocking Miss Langley's view. Eleanor stepped aside. She was good at stepping aside. 14 months in Lady Fenwick's service had taught her the geometry of invisibility, the precise distance a companion must keep to remain useful and unseen. She pressed her back to the column behind her and folded her hands and watched the room reorder itself around the new Viscount, the way iron filings reorder around a magnet. He did not smile. He did not greet the crowd with the expansive warmth the county expected from its returning hero. He stood in the doorway with his weight on the cane and his left hand at the breast of his coat, fingers resting against the fabric above his heart, as though checking that something was still there. Then his gaze swept the room, and it passed over Lady Fenwick in her emerald satin, and it passed over Miss Sophia Langley in her ivory silk, and it stopped. It stopped on Eleanor. She felt the moment his eyes found her the way she might feel a hand pressed flat to her breastbone. A warmth, a pressure, an awareness so specific it canceled the noise of the room around it. He looked at her for 3 full seconds, which was longer than anyone had looked at her in 14 months. And then his jaw tightened and his gaze moved on, and the room resumed its noise. No one else saw it. No one ever saw the clergyman's girl. Eleanor's father had died 18 months ago in the study of the rectory where she had grown up. He had left behind a library she loved, a garden she had tended since she was 9, and debts of £400 she had not known existed until the solicitor arrived with the ledger and the apology. The books were sold first. Then the furniture. Then the rectory itself was reclaimed by the diocese, and Eleanor Prescott, 23 years old and without family, without fortune, and without a single relation willing to claim her, had entered Lady Fenwick's household as a paid companion at £30 per annum. The work was not hard. The work was the easy part. She read aloud in the mornings, organized correspondence in the afternoons, and sat in silence through the evenings while Lady Fenwick entertained. She wore the same gray dress to every occasion because Lady Fenwick had made it clear that a companion's wardrobe should announce her station and nothing more. She ate after the family had finished. She slept in the room above the kitchen where the plaster cracked each winter, and the window did not close entirely against the cold. The difficult part was the word Lady Fenwick had chosen for her. She had heard it first in the private sitting room. 3 days after her arrival, when Lady Fenwick had introduced her to her niece. "This is my new companion, Sophia, the clergyman's girl. She reads well enough, and she does not eat much." Sophia had looked at Eleanor the way one looks at a footstool that has been placed in the wrong corner, and Eleanor had curtsied and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not cost her the £30. Sophia Langley was 20, fair-haired, and possessed of the sort of beauty that functions as its own introduction. Lady Fenwick had raised her since the death of Sophia's parents, and had devoted considerable resources to the project of her niece's advantageous marriage. The autumn ball was the latest stage of that project. Every candle, every arrangement of late roses, every selection of music had been calculated toward a single outcome. Sophia would dance with the new Viscount. The Viscount would see what Lady Fenwick required him to see. And the clergyman's girl would stand behind the column and hold Lady Fenwick's shawl, and witness the transaction from the precise distance at which she could be useful and unseen. Eleanor watched from that distance now as Lady Fenwick guided Sophia across the ballroom toward the Viscount. Sophia's gown caught the candlelight in a way that seemed rehearsed, and her hand was steady on Lady Fenwick's arm, and her smile was the practiced, warm, correct smile of a young woman who had been told since girlhood that this moment would come, and she would be ready for it. The Viscount accepted the introduction with a short bow. He did not extend his hand for the dance. He said something Eleanor could not hear, and Lady Fenwick laughed a laugh that was slightly too bright, and Sophia tilted her head in a way that exposed the line of her throat, and the Viscount's gaze drifted, just once, just for a breath, to the column where Eleanor stood with the shawl folded over her arm. Then he looked away, and Eleanor's pulse, which had been steady all evening, was no longer steady. She knew him. That was the truth she had carried silently since the moment the cane struck the marble. She knew Captain Julian Ashworth, now Viscount Ashworth, because 3 years ago, before the war, before her father's death, before the debts and the grey dress and the room above the kitchen, she had danced with him once at a country assembly in the village of Haltham. He had asked her about the book she was carrying. She had told him it was Herodotus. He had said, "In the original?" And she had said, "My father insists." And he had almost smiled, and the music had ended, and he had bowed and walked away. And she had thought about that almost smile for longer than she would ever admit to anyone. She had also written him a letter, 8 months ago, from this very house, in a hand she had kept steady through force of will. And she did not know whether it had reached him, or what it had cost him if it had, or whether the cane and the limp and the careful way he managed his left leg had anything to do with the words she had committed to paper and sent into the war. The morning after the ball, Eleanor found the library at Fenwick House occupied. She came early, as she always did, before Lady Fenwick woke and the day's duties compressed her hours into the narrow channels of service. The library was the one room where she could sit without permission, because Lady Fenwick never entered it, and Sophia found books tedious, and for 14 months it had been Eleanor's only private country. She had memorized the particular way the autumn light struck the east window at 7 o'clock, the warmth of the chair nearest the fire, the smell of old leather and dust that reminded her of her father's study in the months before the debts had emptied it. This morning, the chair nearest the fire was occupied. The Viscount sat with his injured leg extended, the cane propped against the armrest, and a book open in his lap. He looked up when the door opened, and Eleanor stopped in the threshold, with her hand still on the handle, and the air suddenly thin in her throat. "Miss Prescott." His voice was lower than she remembered. Quieter. He said her name the way one says a word in a language one has been practicing alone. "My lord." She curtsied and did not enter, and did not. The room's proportions had changed. "I did not realize anyone would be here. I will come back later." Sit down." It was not an invitation. It was a command, delivered in the same level tone a man uses when he is accustomed to being obeyed and has forgotten that the rest of the world is not his regiment. Eleanor hesitated. He did not repeat himself. He simply waited, his gaze steady on her face, until she crossed the room and lowered herself into the chair opposite his, with her back straight, and her hands clasped in her lap, and her eyes on the fire rather than on him. The silence between them held everything she could not say. The letter. The war. The cane. The way his hand had rested against his coat last night, over his heart, as though guarding something he could not afford to lose. "You are Lady Fenwick's companion." He said it as though confirming a fact he had already verified. "I am." "Since when?" 14 months. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the fire settling in the grate. She could hear the tall clock on the mantel counting seconds. She could hear her own breathing, which was steadier than it had any right to be given the distance between his chair and hers, which was 4 feet at most. And the fact that she could see the place where his left hand rested on his thigh, just above the knee, the fingers pressing slightly against the fabric the way a man presses against a wound that has not finished teaching him its lessons. "Your father," he said. "I was told." "Yes." "I am sorry." She looked at him then. His face was harder than it had been 3 years ago. The lines around his mouth were deeper, and there was a quality to his stillness that she had not seen before, a controlled, watchful patience that had the weight of something earned rather than natural. The war had carved him the way water carves stone, removing what was soft and leaving what could bear pressure. "You are kind, my lord," she said. She meant it. She also meant it as a closing, a phrase that would permit her to stand and leave and return the library to its former emptiness and herself to the gray distance of service. "Eat something before you go." She paused. On the table between their chairs sat a tray she had not noticed, laid with bread, cold ham, and a pot of tea still faintly steaming. 2 cups. He had asked the kitchen for 2 cups, which meant he had known she would come, which meant he had been paying a kind of attention that her 14 months of invisibility had trained her not to expect. "I eat with the household, my lord." "Eat something now." His voice did not rise. His face did not change. He simply poured the tea into the 2nd cup and set it on her side of the table and returned his gaze to his book. And the command sat in the air between them like a held hand she had not been offered and could not refuse. Eleanor picked up the cup. The tea was hot and strong and sweetened with honey, which was how she had taken it as a girl in her father's rectory. And there was no reason the Viscount should know that, and there was no reason the warmth of the cup against her cold fingers should feel like the first kind thing anyone had done for her in 14 months. And there was no reason at all for the pressure that built suddenly behind her eyes. She did not let it fall. She drank the tea. He read his book. Neither of them spoke again that morning, and the silence this time was not loud with what she could not say. It was simply warm. 3 days later, Lady Fenwick held a dinner in the Viscount's honor. The table was set for 16. Sophia wore cream silk with pearl drops at her ears, and Lady Fenwick had positioned her at the Viscount's right hand, and the arrangement of guests had been calibrated so that every person present could see the pairing and draw the conclusion Lady Fenwick intended them to draw. Eleanor served from the periphery. She carried dishes from the sideboard and refilled glasses and kept her gaze on the task, and did not look at the head of the table, where the Viscount sat with his back very straight, and his answers very short, and his left hand resting on his thigh beneath the cloth. It was during the 2nd course that Lady Fenwick addressed the table at large. She was speaking of the Viscount's return and the county's delight at having him home, and she paused, and she turned to Mrs. Harding. the wife of the magistrate, and she said, "Even the clergyman's girl nearly wept when he walked in. I saw her face from across the room. One would think she had some claim." The table laughed. A polite, contained, well-mannered laugh that understood its function was to diminish one person and elevate another. Eleanor, standing near the sideboard with a serving dish in her hands, felt the heat climb her throat and held her grip and said nothing. The Viscount's hand stilled on his glass. He did not laugh. He did not look at Eleanor. He looked at Lady Fenwick with an expression that was perfectly composed and entirely unreadable. And then he set his glass down and said, in the level voice he used for all consequential statements, "Miss Prescott served your household admirably tonight, Lady Fenwick. Her composure is a credit to her." The table went quiet. Lady Fenwick's smile thinned. The dinner resumed, and Eleanor's hands, holding the dish, trembled once, and then did not tremble again. After dinner, the party moved to the drawing room. Sophia played the pianoforte, correctly and without passion. Lady Fenwick surveyed the room from her chair with the assessing gaze of a general reading the field. The Viscount stood near the window with his weight on the cane and declined every attempt at conversation with a courtesy so precise it functioned as a wall. Eleanor was clearing the last of the crystal from the dining room when she heard the sound. It came from the small parlor off the back hall, where Lady Fenwick's mother, Mrs. Clifton, spent her evenings alone. Mrs. Clifton was 81 years old and largely deaf, and given to wandering the house at odd hours, calling for a daughter who had stopped sitting with her years ago. The sound was her voice, thin and frightened, calling a name that no one in the drawing room could hear. Eleanor set down the glass she was carrying and went to her. She found Mrs. Clifton standing in the dark parlor in her nightdress, her white hair loose around her shoulders, her hands gripping the back of a chair so tightly the knuckles had gone ivory. The old woman was shaking. She had knocked a vase from the side table, and the water had spread across the floor, and she was standing in it in her bare feet and calling for a woman named Alice, who was her daughter, who was Lady Fenwick, who was in the drawing room displaying Sophia to the Viscount, and had no intention of answering. "Mrs. Clifton." Eleanor knelt. The water soaked the hem of her gray dress instantly, the cold biting through the fabric. She took the old woman's hands, which were thin and ice-cold, and gripping with surprising force. "I am here. Come, sit down. Let me warm your feet." She guided Mrs. Clifton into the chair. She found a blanket from the cabinet. She dried the old woman's feet with a cloth from the sideboard and wrapped them carefully, and held her hands and spoke to her in the low, steady voice she had once used with her own father when the debts had kept him awake, and the study had grown cold and the candles had burned low. Mrs. Clifton did not know who she was. Mrs. Clifton called her Alice. Eleanor did not correct her. She simply held the old woman's hands and let the name stand. She did not know the Viscount was in the doorway. She did not know he had left the drawing room, or that he had heard the same thin voice she had heard through 2 walls and a corridor, or that he had followed the sound and arrived 3 steps behind her and stood in the dark hallway with his weight on his cane and watched her kneel on the wet floor and tend to an old woman who could not tell her from a ghost. He stood there for a long time, long enough to see her tuck the blanket around Mrs. Clifton's knees, long enough to see her hand smooth the white hair back from the old woman's forehead with a tenderness so practiced it could only have been learned in the care of someone she loved, long enough to hear her say, in a voice so quiet it barely carried past the doorframe, "You are not alone. I am right here." He turned and walked back to the drawing room. The sound of his cane on the floorboards was slower than it had been, and his hand, as he walked, moved to his coat, to the place above his heart. The mornings in the library continued. The Viscount came earlier each day, and each day the tray was laid with 2 cups, and each day Eleanor sat and drank the tea and read, and did not name the thing that was building between them in the warm silence of that room. "You knew my brother," he said on the 5th morning, without looking up from his book. "I met him once, at the assembly in Haltham. He spoke of that evening." A pause. The fire shifted in the grate. "He said you were carrying Herodotus. Your brother remembered that?" "I remembered it." He turned a page. "I mentioned it to him." The admission sat between them like a dropped coin in a quiet room. Eleanor looked at her book and did not see the words. Her fingers were tight around the spine, and her pulse was visible in her wrist, and she pressed her wrist against her knee. On the 7th morning, the library door opened, and it was not Eleanor who entered, and it was not a servant. It was Lady Fenwick herself. And her expression when she saw them both seated on either side of the fire with their books and their silence and their 2 cups was the expression of a woman who discovers that a door she locked has been opened from the inside. She said nothing. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at the Viscount. She turned and left. And the sound of her heels on the floorboards was sharp and deliberate, and carried the weight of a decision being made. That afternoon, Eleanor was told the library was no longer available to her in the mornings. Miss Langley would take it henceforth. "Walk with me," the Viscount said the following morning when Eleanor passed through the garden on her way to the upstairs rooms Lady Fenwick had confined her to. He was standing at the edge of the gravel path with his cane and his coat, and his face like carved stone, and the command was quiet and unadorned and left no space for refusal. They walked the length of the garden in silence. The October air was sharp. The hedges were turning copper. His left leg held its weight longer than his right, and the gravel registered the uneven rhythm, and Eleanor matched her pace to his without thinking, because her body had begun making accommodations for him that her mind had not authorized. At the far wall, he stopped. His hand moved to his coat, to the place above his heart, and this time he drew the thing out. A letter. Folded, creased, darkened at one corner, with what might have been smoke, or what might have been blood. He held it in his open palm and looked at it the way a man looks at a compass that led him home through terrain he did not expect to survive. "You wrote this," he said. Eleanor's breath stopped. She recognized the paper. She recognized the fold. She recognized her own hand, the careful slant of her letters visible even from 4 feet away. "I did not know if it reached you," she whispered. "It reached me on the morning of the 16th of March. His voice was level. His face was still. Only his hand, the one holding the letter, was not entirely steady. The French had positioned 2 battalions in the woods above our camp. Your letter named the positions exactly. The intelligence was accurate. I reorganized the line and withdrew to higher ground before dawn. We saved most of the regiment. Most. 11 men did not withdraw in time." He folded the letter and returned it to his coat. "I went back for them. The musket ball caught me crossing the stream below the ridge. The limp, the cane, the careful way he managed his weight. All of it traced back to a piece of paper she had written at 3 o'clock in the morning in the room above Lady Fenwick's kitchen, by the light of a single candle she could not afford to burn, with intelligence she had overheard at Lady Fenwick's own dinner table when a visiting colonel had spoken too freely about troop positions and assumed the clergyman's girl was too insignificant to listen. "I should not have sent it," she said. "You saved 200 men. I cost you 11. And your leg." He looked at her. The mask he wore in public, the discipline and the distance and the stone, cracked along a single visible line. It was not much. the tightening of his jaw, the brief closing of his eyes, a breath drawn through the nose and held for 3 counted seconds. "The letter is why I came home," he said. The mask returned. He began walking again. Eleanor walked beside him, and her hand was pressed hard against her sternum, where something had shifted and would not shift back. And the garden was very quiet, and the copper hedges held the October light. And neither of them spoke again until they reached the house, and he held the door for her and said, "Go inside. You are cold." She was not cold. She was burning. She went inside. If you are listening to Eleanor's story and you feel the ache of being seen after a long invisibility, you already know what is coming. You know because your body knows, the way hers does, that some things arrive not when they are asked for, and not when they are expected, only when they can no longer be refused. The ache did not have long to live in quiet. Lady Fenwick moved swiftly when she identified a threat, and she had survived 30 years of county society by understanding that the most dangerous disruptions do not announce themselves with noise. They arrive as silences, as 2 cups on a library tray, as an almost smile across a ballroom. On the morning of the Fenwick Harvest Supper, which was held each year in the same ballroom where the autumn ball had opened the season, Eleanor was summoned to the morning room. Lady Fenwick stood at the window. Sophia sat in the chair by the fire with her hands folded. Mr. Hargreaves, the family solicitor, stood near the door with a leather case on his knee and the expression of a man who would prefer to be elsewhere. "Miss Langley and Viscount Ashworth will announce their engagement this evening," Lady Fenwick said. She delivered it the way she delivered all consequential statements, as though the world had already agreed and was merely catching up. Eleanor looked at Sophia. Sophia's face was composed, certain, rehearsed. Her hands were still in her lap. Her eyes were steady. "Has the Viscount proposed?" Eleanor asked. It was the first question she had asked Lady Fenwick in 14 months that was not about a schedule or a menu or a shawl. "The Viscount will be guided by his own good judgment and the reasonable expectations of the county," Lady Fenwick said. "Mr. Hargreaves has prepared the settlement papers. The families have understood the arrangement for some time. It requires only the public confirmation, which will take place tonight." She paused. "You will not be present." "My lady?" "Your service is concluded, Miss Prescott." Lady Fenwick did not turn from the window. "Your wages through the quarter are prepared. You will be gone before the supper begins. Mr. Hargreaves will provide a written reference." The room was very still. Mr. Hargreaves looked at the floor. Sophia looked at her own hands. Eleanor stood in the center of the morning room in her gray dress, with the water stain still visible at the hem from the night she had knelt to warm Mrs. Clifton's feet. And the floor seemed to tilt beneath her, and her fingers found the edge of the nearest table and held. "I have nowhere to go," she said. It was not self-pity. It was arithmetic. 400 pounds of her father's debt still stood, and 30 pounds per annum had been the only wall between herself and the kind of poverty that has no floor. "That is not my concern." Lady Fenwick turned at last. Her face was not cruel. It was efficient, the way a closed ledger is efficient. "The clergyman's girl has been a satisfactory companion, and I will write it in the reference. You may collect it from Mr. Hargreaves on your way out." There it was again. The clergyman's girl. The label that had followed her through 14 months of silence and service, through mornings in the library and evenings behind the column and nights in the room above the kitchen. It landed now with the finality of a bolt being drawn, and the part of her that had kept its shape through all of it, the debts and the gray dress and the letter she had written at 3 a.m. to save a man who had almost smiled at her once, that part straightened. "I was never only the clergyman's girl," she said. Her voice was quiet. It did not shake. "I am the woman who sat with your mother when you would not. I dried her feet and held her hands and told her she was not alone, while you were in the drawing room, arranging Sophia's future. And whatever the Viscount decides this evening, it will not be because I was removed from the room before he could decide it. He has already seen me, Lady Fenwick. Months ago. Years ago. He saw me before you ever thought to look." The words fell into the silence of the morning room like stones into a well. Lady Fenwick's composure held, just barely. Her hand moved to the brooch at her throat and closed around it, and her mouth opened and pressed shut and opened again, and no sound emerged. Eleanor curtsied. She left the room. She climbed the stairs to the room above the kitchen and packed her bag, which took very little time because she owned very little, and sat on the narrow bed and looked at the window that did not close entirely against the cold, and waited for the ache in her chest to resolve itself into something she could carry out the door. It did not resolve. It stayed. The harvest supper at Fenwick House was the final event of the county's autumn calendar, and the ballroom that had hosted the opening ball now hosted its close. The same candles, the same musicians, the same late roses, browner at the edges now. The same crowd dressed in the same careful hierarchy, arranged around the same floor where 6 weeks earlier Eleanor had pressed her back to a column and watched a man with a cane enter the room. She was not supposed to be here. Lady Fenwick had dismissed her. Her bag was packed, her wages collected. The reference was in her pocket, folded beside the £3 and 6 shillings that remained of her savings after the debts had consumed the rest. She had come down the back stairs intending to leave through the kitchen door, and she had almost reached it when Mrs. Dalton stopped her in the corridor. Mrs. Dalton was 63 years old and had served the Ashworth household since before Julian was born. She had known Eleanor's mother. She had attended Eleanor's christening in the stone church at Haltham. She had not spoken to Eleanor once during the 14 months of service at Fenwick House, because they served different households, and their paths had not crossed. They crossed now. "You are not leaving through the kitchen," Mrs. Dalton said. She said it with the quiet authority of a woman who has managed a great house for 4 decades and does not require a title to give an order. "You are coming with me. Mrs. Dalton, I have been dismissed." "I heard." Mrs. Dalton took Eleanor's arm. Her grip was firm and warm, and permitted no negotiation. "His lordship has been asking for you since he arrived. Come." Eleanor did not come willingly. She came because Mrs. Dalton's hand on her arm was the second act of uncomplicated kindness she had received in 14 months. She came because the part of her that had straightened in Lady Fenwick's morning room had not yet bent back. And she came because, if she was honest, and Eleanor Prescott was always honest, even when honesty was expensive, she wanted to see his face one more time before she disappeared. Mrs. Dalton led her through the servants' corridor and into the ballroom through the side entrance. The crowd was thick, and the music was playing. At the far end of the room, Lady Fenwick stood on the low platform where announcements were customarily made, and beside her stood Sophia in ivory silk, and beside Sophia stood Mr. Hargreaves with the leather case, and the room was arranging itself into the posture of expectation. The Viscount was not on the platform. He was standing near the column where Eleanor had stood 6 weeks earlier, and his hand was at his coat, over his heart, and his eyes were moving across the crowd with the controlled, systematic attention of a man searching for one specific face. He found it. Eleanor stood in the side entrance with Mrs. Dalton's hand on her arm, and her packed bag at her feet, and her gray dress, and her £3 6 shillings, and her father's debts, and her invisible life. And the Viscount of Ashworth looked across the ballroom at her, and something in his face. The mask, the discipline, the stone, broke open the way ice breaks on a river at the first true hour of spring. He walked toward her. The crowd parted. Not because he commanded them to, and not because they understood what was happening, simply because a man with a cane and that expression on his face is a man the room steps aside for. His left leg carried its weight a half-beat longer than his right, and the cane struck the floor with the same measured sound it had made 6 weeks earlier. And the ballroom fell silent in expanding rings, the way water goes still outward from the place where a stone has been dropped. Lady Fenwick's voice carried from the platform. "Lord Ashworth, we are about to begin." He did not stop. He did not look at her. He crossed the ballroom in 15 strides and halted in front of Eleanor, and stood there for a moment that held the full weight of everything the room did not yet know. The letter, and the limp, and the 200 men saved, and the 11 who did not come home, and the mornings in the library, and the second cup of tea sweetened with honey. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The room was quiet enough for a whisper to carry from the column to the platform and back. "Miss Prescott will be Viscountess Ashworth. That is not a request." 9 words. The room heard every one of them. Sophia's hand went to the pearl at her ear. Mr. Hargreaves closed the leather case with a soft click and stepped back from the platform. Lady Fenwick's mouth opened and her breath caught, and her hand went to the brooch at her throat. And for the first time in 30 years of managing the county's social architecture, no sound came from her. Her face worked through something private and enormous. And then it settled, not into defeat exactly, into the expression of a woman who has built a structure and watched it undone by a force her categories could not measure. Mrs. Dalton spoke into the silence. Her voice was clear and carried the weight of 4 decades and a christening she still remembered. "His lordship's choice is made. I have known Miss Prescott since the day she was born. There is no finer woman in this county." The crowd stirred. A murmur moved through the room the way wind moves through a field of grain, not loud, simply present and growing and impossible to stop. One voice said, "Well." Another said, "Did you know?" A third, belonging to Mrs. Harding, the magistrate's wife, said quietly to the woman beside her, "She was always more than the clergyman's girl, was she not?" And the revised verdict traveled outward through the crowd, not with spectacle, simply with the quiet collective recognition of people who have been shown something they should have noticed long before. The Viscount extended his hand, palm up, open. Not a command this time. An offer. Eleanor looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She looked at the place on his coat where the letter lived, the letter she had written at 3 a.m. by the light of a candle she could not afford to burn. And her eyes were full, and her breath was unsteady, and the room was watching, and none of it mattered. She took his hand. Lady Fenwick did not leave the platform immediately. She stood with her hand at the brooch, and her posture held. Sophia touched her arm. Something passed between them that did not require speech, and Lady Fenwick stepped down and walked toward the main doors. And the crowd parted for her too, though for different reasons. Her back was very straight. She did not look at Eleanor or the Viscount. She looked ahead, and she left. And the room watched her go with the complicated silence a room offers to a woman whose authority has been permanent and is now, suddenly, not. Sophia remained a moment longer. She looked across the ballroom at Eleanor, and her face was not shattered, only altered. The way a landscape alters when a certainty that has always sat at its center is quietly removed. She inclined her head. The gesture was gracious and real. Then she too gathered her skirts and left. Mr. Hargreaves approached the Viscount. They spoke in low, practical tones. The settlements would be redrawn. The solicitor made a note and bowed and retreated, and the musicians resumed playing, and the harvest supper continued around the two people standing near the column, as though the room had absorbed a new truth and simply carried on. The following week, Eleanor's bag was unpacked in a room at Ashworth Hall that had tall windows and plaster that did not crack, and a fireplace large enough to warm the whole of it. Mrs. Dalton had overseen the preparation herself. Fresh linens, a vase of late chrysanthemums from the garden, a writing desk placed beneath the east-facing window where the morning light fell in a clean, wide band, because Mrs. Dalton remembered that Eleanor's mother had always written by morning light, and Mrs. Dalton forgot very little. Eleanor sat at the desk on her first evening in the house and looked out the window at the grounds. The autumn had deepened. The oaks along the drive had turned gold and rust, and the light was the low amber light of late October, and somewhere in the house below her she could hear Mrs. Dalton giving instructions about supper, and somewhere further she could hear the sound of the Viscount's cane on the floorboards, steady and measured, moving through the rooms of his own house. The way a man moves through a place he is learning to recognize as something other than empty. He found her there an hour later. He stood in the doorway, the way he had stood in the doorway of Lady Fenwick's library on that first morning, his weight on the cane, his left hand at his coat. Only this time he did not need to check that the letter was still there. He had already given it back. It lay on the desk in front of Eleanor, unfolded, smoothed flat, the creases and the stain and her own handwriting visible in the candlelight. She had read it twice since he placed it in her hand on the evening of the harvest supper, and both times she had been struck by how ordinary it was. Troop positions, numbers, a terrain description, and a single closing line she had thought, when she wrote it, was merely honest. I could not know this and say nothing. She had not known, when she chose those words, that they would cross a sea and reach a man on the morning before a battle and save 200 lives and cost 11, and leave him with a limp he would carry the rest of his years and a letter he would carry above his heart. She had not known that the same words would bring him home. She had only known that she possessed a piece of intelligence that mattered, and that silence, when silence costs lives, is not modesty. And Eleanor Prescott, the clergyman's girl, the companion in the gray dress with the water-stained hem, had never been capable of silence when it mattered. The Viscount crossed the room. He did not speak. He sat in the chair beside the desk and extended his injured leg and rested the cane against the wall and looked at the letter on the desk, and then at her face, and then at the window, where the last of the October light was settling across the grounds like a hand laid gently on good earth. "Eleanor," he said, just her name, her given name, spoken for the first time in his voice, in the room that was now hers, in the house that would be their home. She reached across the distance between them and placed her hand over his. His fingers closed around hers. The letter lay on the desk between the candle and the chrysanthemums, its words finished, its work complete. Outside, the oaks held their gold against the evening, and the light was warm, and the house was quiet, and Eleanor Prescott was seen. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's journey moved you, carry it with you tonight.